Thanks for the download. If you're enjoying the pod series, then please follow The Unconventional Soldier on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. If you can, leave a decent review, share it with a mate, and help us keep these stories of soldiering history alive while supporting military voices that rarely get heard. Positive reviews and recommendations really help bring us to the attention of new listeners. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, so we'd be grateful for any follows over there too. If you want to help keep the mic on and the episodes flowing, then head to the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Every brew keeps us in the fight by lowering production costs, and many thanks to our recent contributors. My guests today are Neil Smiles, a former soldier now working in the defence industry, and Wilf Owen, another former soldier and author of the book Euclid's Army, Preparing Land Forces for Warfare Today. The conversation focuses on modern military doctrine, training and equipment for Western armies, and Wilf challenges traditional assumptions about land warfare. Key topics include the necessity of rigorous training to build soldier resilience and the evolving role of the infantryman as a sensor on the modern battlefield. We explore other issues such as affordability and future utility of main battle tanks, deficiencies in current close combat fire support, and the crucial yet often overlooked logistical challenges posed by field hospital deployment. Let's crack on. I'm fortunate tonight to have two guests. My first, Neil Smiles. He's a pod regular and needs no introduction. He's appeared on previous episodes, namely number 51, Guns, Rockets and Training for War, number 65, The Past, Present and Future of Drones in the British Army, and number 86, Beyond the Battlefield, Exploring British Army Simulation Training. So they're well worth checking out. So great to see you again, Neil.
Thank you for having me back on,
You're
Colin.
welcome, mate. My second guest is Wilf Owen, who served in both regular and reserve units of the British Army. He's a military technology writer, theorist and consultant, and speaks and presents to military audiences on a wide range of subjects. He's currently writing his doctoral thesis in war studies at King's College. Welcome to the pod, Wilf.
It's a very great pleasure to be here.
Your book, Euclid's Army, Preparing Land Forces for Warfare Today, rejects much of the conventional wisdom about the makeup of a modern army. And you challenge many of the mainstream ideas about the future of land warfare and go back to basics. And I know Neil shares a lot of these ideas that you set out in your book. But before I hand over to Neil, who will lead this conversation, because I said to you in the warm-up, it's a bit above my pay grade, I'd like to ask you why you picked Euclid, an ancient Greek mathematician, for your book title.
Well, I mean, the book was originally called Bill Occam's Army, as in William of Ockham, which would have raised, I think, equal questions, because there is a philosophical tool called Occam's razor, which says that you basically have to go back to basics. And after a few discussions with people said, no, that's pretty abstract. No one's going to latch onto that. So I just had it in my mind that I would call it Euclid's Army, because Euclid, as you say, an ancient Greek mathematician, really laid down the basics of modern mathematics, of which almost all else is then built. So he put down what he called postulates, which were broad, very correct ideas, which you can't conduct the rest of mathematics and geometry without. So I basically used that as my working title, and it somewhat stuck. I generally get two comments, which is anybody who went to university is, well, that's an excellent title. And then from most of my mates, it's who is Euclid and what's it got to do with the army?
And I think I've just given away that I never went to uni. So, on that bombshell, Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to start, as you should, I suppose, with your introduction, Will. Now, there was a great line. I think when Colin asked me to do this, I thought he wanted me to sort of challenge some of the things that were in there. But when I read it, I think pretty quickly it turns out that I think I agree with you with a lot of things. But there was one line in the introduction, which I've got to quote, that really got me hooked. As someone who has argued against the opinion of the senior officer present numerous times, I've no problem holding difficult views, which I thought was great. But when you sat down to write Euclid's Army, what was the one myth or lazy assumption about modern land warfare that you just couldn't let stand anymore? I mean, was there a particular event or moment that pushed you over the edge and made you say, right, I've got to write this book?
I don't think there was one event. I think there was the series of events that eventually something broke the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. I mean, going all the way back to being a very junior rifleman standing on a windswept hillside in Wales saying, why are we doing this? Why are we walking slowly towards the enemy? I'm pretty sure this doesn't work. Or, any number of things I did in my short and very unglamorous military career. But then later on, when I started doing sort of contract work for the British Army, it became evident to me that there was a lot of assumptions and ideas for which there wasn't any clear answer. I mean, there was no real reason as to why things were done in particular ways. And when you burrowed down, it was sort of the question almost got thrown back at me, which was, well, don't you know? And I didn't know. And so the question I sort of started off with to write the book really was a question that was once asked of me, which is, well, if all that evidence is true, why are we doing it this way? If we all agree on the basically what's wrong, why don't we correct it? And I think that's, that was really the start point for the book, which was let's kill a few sacred cows and then see what doesn't happen. So that was really where I started from.
And this is all about preparation, isn't it? The book is about preparing an army for war. That's the general thrust of it. That's what I figured out anyway. I didn't go to uni either, so maybe me and Colin are both way off.
And nor did I. That's why I'm doing my doctorate in my early 60s.
Glutton for punishment. Colin also pointed me a few days ago to a recent RUSI article by Hamish Mundell, where he refers to first battle bias. And I suppose when you're looking at an army preparing for war, do you think modern armies spend too much time trying to predict the next war? Even like Hamish says, the opening engagement rather than preparing for any war?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a constant piece of mood music that runs through the British Army, and in fact almost every other army in the world, is in order to be good at what we're going to be good at, we have to predict where, when, and how the enemy will fight. And certainly both within all our professional careers, we can remember being very prepared to fight the Russians in North Germany, and then finding everybody was off to the Gulf to fight the Iraqis, or the Falklands War broke out just after I completed basic training. Nobody to the event, I can clearly remember having to go to the library to find a book to find out where the Falklands was. We're generally, most nations are very bad at predicting against whom and why and where they will fight. The bit I'm absolutely locked onto is you've got to know how to fight. So if you don't have a broad, solid base of fundamental training, then your first battle is going to be a fiasco as you sort of attempt to feel your way through it. Now, go back to Task Force Smith in Korea, when the Americans first deployed at the beginning of the Korean War, had all the warning signs that that was a possibility. But the British Army of 1914, the old contemptibles, acquitted themselves very well based on just good, solid training. And that's my point, which is there's, no one should speak against broadly correct, fundamental, grassroots training methodologies that deliver you in a good enough state to fight the next war.
Can I just jump in here? I've been reading a lot about BOR recently, and I think there's a rose-tinted version of BOR where we tend to look back and think we had the mass and we had the equipment. And following Bagnall's reforms in the 80s, where we shifted from forward defence to the manoeuvrist approach, fighting the depth battle as well. But what I drew from my reading lately was, throughout the Cold War, we didn't really have the equipment until sort of the last 3 years of the Cold War. The Germans had Marder, they had Leopard 1 from the early 70s. So is there a bit of a myth that we've always, when we look back at the Cold War, we think we got it right then, whereas we're missing out some important aspects like the poor kit and equipment that didn't really come in until Warrior, Challenger and MLRS?
Yeah, no, very definitely. I think BAOR is a very not helpful example of how to organise an army, in that it was a garrison-based force designed to die in place in a nuclear war in 2 to 4 weeks fighting. And the idea was to basically hold the Russians long enough for diplomacy to break out. I mean, at no time, even, when I graduated to sort of speaking to senior officers, did I ever hear anybody come up with an idea of how the Cold War was supposed to be won had it turned hot. I think Bagnall forced the issue more than anything else, in that he made it very apparent that even to die in place after 2 weeks, if you didn't have a reasonably innovative methodology of fighting, then you weren't even going to last 2 weeks. That said, I think we painted the Russians 10 foot tall. And I think I think history's borne that out. But no, BAOR did not create a force to do anything other than what it was designed to do, in the shadow of the inner German border. And we all both well know that to deploy one div to the Gulf meant stripping every single core enabler out of Germany and sending it down there. So, we do have a very rose-tinted view of BAOR. I mean, the thing that made BAOR, and I think the reason why people do have a tinted view, is because we did the training. I mean, we did spend 70 to 90 days every year in the field doing the training. You went to Battus, and that's what created the level of confidence that which we now look back on, with longing, that we are probably never going to be able to recreate again in the future, at least for cost. So it's rose tinted. I think it's a very very positive term in that respect.
I think you're right about the training. Rose-tinted is one thing, but it is the memory I have of being every 6 weeks or so out of barracks. And then there was the smattering of active edges that were called during the year where you were out of barracks in a couple of hours. And I think the training did have it. Now, we may as well jump to training. I mean, the difference between good armies and bad armies is training, and I think you say that in spades. But if you could overhaul one thing about how Western armies train today, just one thing, what would it be?
I think that they should do it. I don't mean that in a flippant sense. I mean, I think that, you really have to, at the beginning of the year, you have to lay out all the things you want your battalion, unit, regiment, or formation to do. And you have to do a certain amount of work up to ensure they get to that standard. And then you have to go out and you have to test that standard. And I mean, I was quite shocked in some of the training events I attended in terms of when I was working on Doctrine in Command in the British Army, as to how things tended to be fairy dusted away like logistics. Because in some cases the data and the experience just wasn't there, whereas in the Cold War, it definitely would have been, and that led to quite a few very interesting conversations as to, well, how did we used to do that? And it was somewhat bizarre that I was, on rare occasions, I was possibly the only person in the room that had an inkling as to how that might be done. But no, I mean, the great secret, there is no secret to training. I mean, the great secret is that you do it, that you have a training program, you stick to it, and your training program is built around creating the fundamental skills, drills, and I can't emphasize this enough, I think robustness. I think that's one of the things that might be missing from modern approaches to training, is that nobody liked crawling up a river, at Brecon in the middle of the night, just to get soaking wet. But the one thing it did was it did create a certain level of for want of a better word, bloody-mindedness that, you could push through and you could get things done, and you did know how to look after yourself. And I think the view of training, that training is somehow more an education process than a testing your robustness and testing your mental fortitude, is a mistake. I think training's got to balance that being cold, wet and hungry, rather than, playing the safety case of saying, oh, we've got to keep them fed, we've got to give them a warm drink. Well, sometimes there's going to be there's going to be 12 to 14 hours of darkness. Your sleeping bag is going to be soaked wet through, so are you, and there isn't going to be a warm drink, and you're going to have to do something the next morning. And that's not just to sound sort of relentlessly salty and gnarly. I think anybody would recognise that as being a key component of training. And I'm not saying the Army doesn't do that. I just think that if you want to understand what the gold standard of good training looks like, then that's the gold standard of good training.
I've got 2 points just to add to what you've said there, Wilf, in that coming up to the end of the year, I remember just before when I was in Germany, you go on parade and you basically handed out what you're going to be doing for the next year. And the year normally went, you'd be given your courses that you attend, the career courses. Then the year would start off with troop training, lead up to battery training, regimental firing camp. There might well be a div level exercise. Every couple of years there'd be a core level exercise. So you definitely had that. And going back to your resilience piece, I interviewed a United States Marine Corps MARSOC recce guy a couple of months ago. And we had this very similar conversation. And he said to me that there's no doubt now that the MARSOC Marines these days, they're fitter, they're more like athletes, they are better educated, and they have a lot more knowledge. But he brought up what you said, their resilience is not the same because they're not getting out on the ground, getting wet and cold for long extended periods. So it's funny that it bleeds across to other armies as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for the old adage, which is that hard in training, easy in war, which, never having been to war, I'm not convinced that actually plays through, but I know enough people who have that to say that that does seem to have some credence. But yes, I mean, the resilience is a very major part of that. Having said that, I mean, again, I've got to make it clear for the audience, I don't believe there's any evidence to suggest that the British Army we've deployed on operations in recent years is less resilient than in times past. My point is that that's something you've got to keep a weather eye on, and that's something that's got to occupy some of the discussions around training, which is the training you're doing breeding the sort of resilience that you want? And I think you fairy dust over that, that is really running risk.
Do you think the disappearance of cap badge leads has had a negative effect on training?
I've got to say that my involvement with training hasn't been in a space where I could necessarily judge that to be true or not true, but there's a simple logic that subject matter experts, I mean, regardless of cap badge, would have to be a good thing. I mean, not everybody, a modern battle group or a formation now is such a complex system that no one person, including the commander, can be across everything. So you do have to have SMEs who really understand what they're on about. And I think if the army really wanted to burrow down on that, it would just be a matter of looking at what standards did those SMEs seek to impart and enforce within training. Not necessarily that they did a lot of talking, but at least you had someone who said that is the right way to do it, and no, that isn't the right way to do it. I think it's got to be as basic as that. I don't think you can afford to make it more complicated.
Chapter 2 is teasingly named "War Without Tanks." Now, I don't want to just regurgitate the whole of your book, but there was a great little vignette in this about the cost of tanks. You state in there that a unit of 58 Challenger 1s cost £928 million. And I was just having a little bit of a look on the Oryx site about a week ago. And at that point, the Russians had lost 4,152 tanks. And I can't even begin to tell you what the figure is. 66 trillion, 432 million pounds worth of tanks. So, but if you were going to buy use the same amount of money, 928 million, you'd only get 72 tanks back. So, yeah. War without tanks. War is going to soon be without tanks, isn't it?
Okay, so the War Without Tanks chapter descended from a article I wrote for Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, of the same name, and you can go and find it online. It's all over the internet. It actually got read by Ben Wallace and some quite senior people, and I did have some interactions based on that, including with the Royal Tank Regiment, who were actually very happy with it, because the sole point I was trying to make, which was that if a modern tank costs as much as it does, and a modern Leopard 2, you can go out on the internet, you can find the figures, it's anything from 20 to 32 million dollars or euros or pounds, however you want to skin that cat. And the fact is that every piece of military equipment does have a definable sticker price to it. It isn't voodoo economics. If you want to go and buy it, you have to be able to sign a check for that amount to get that, regardless of people saying, oh, support and training and all the rest of it. Yep, but it still equates to a dollar value for a particular piece of kit. The point I was trying to make, which was that sooner or later, tanks are going to become unaffordable. They're going to become unaffordable to own, and they're going to become unaffordable to operate. But most importantly, they're going to become unaffordable to lose, because you're not going to have a hangar full of spare tanks. Now, the Israelis keep literally hangars full of spare vehicles, far less today, but historically they've kept very large numbers of tanks in reserve. So have a lot of other armies, the Soviet Union being a really good example. How well some of them were looked after has turned out to be a bit of a debatable case. But no, you need spare tanks. And the historical evidence is absolutely overwhelming, is that if you employ tanks, you lose tanks. It's not you might not lose crews, but you definitely lose tanks. So it's not a debate. If you were going to fight a war tomorrow, there isn't quite a staff officer's handbook chart of how quickly you lose tanks. But if you're fighting a competent enemy, tanks is one of those numbers that go down, they don't go up, and you have to have spare vehicles. So that was the point I was really trying to tease out. It wasn't anything to do with the tank is dead, which I just don't believe. If the tank's dead, so is everything else. I've never understood where that idea has come from, because the second there's something on the battlefield that's killing tanks, it's killing armoured personnel, carriers, self-propelled guns, and everything else. So it's purely a matter of cost. And it's much the same argument as happened with the battleship. The battleship was pretty indestructible in its, it took a lot of firepower to sink the two big Japanese battleships, Yamato and Musashi. I think I've just butchered those names because my Japanese isn't that good. But whatever they were called, they took about 10 torpedoes and 9 bombs to sink each. Now, it wasn't that they weren't survivable, it was that they were unaffordable in terms of building a modern navy after that. The aircraft carrier became a far more flexible tool for the amount of money that you were going to invest. So yeah, war without tanks will happen if costs aren't kept abreast of. And I go on later in the book to explain, what some of those solutions might be, which gets me equal amounts of hate.
Is there a comparison between, and it may be a bad analogy, but between the Tiger tank and the Sherman tank in World War II? Everybody keeps going on about the Tiger tank. There's a couple of thousand of them. There's about 60,000 Shermans. Shermans were a lot cheaper, engineeringly simple. They could cross all the Bailey bridges. The tonnage was kept very, very light. They used modern production methods. Headlights were from the same trucks as Ford were churning out. And you're finding now as well, the likes of the Challenger and Leopard are struggling with the terrain over in Ukraine because they're too heavy. So is there an argument for tanks that are cheaper, lighter, and can be recovered off the battlefield as easily as a Sherman did?
There is a very strong argument, in my view, for tanks that make better use of the amount of money you spend. You've really got to be careful when you say cheaper and lighter, because, of course, the Royal Armoured Corps and absolutely everybody else and some ancient types out there get really upset when, they hear cheaper, because they associate cheaper with something that is a less viable product. But my argument is that isn't the case. There is an argument for lighter tanks. There is an argument for tanks that cost less than tanks currently do. Why wouldn't there be? But the fact is that there's also a lot of peculiar debates out there. I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was to try and re-energize a lot of the force development and a lot of the military debates, which were very common in the 1980s, but have become less so since. Close that rabbit hole for a second. Let's go back to tanks. So people get obsessed with tank weights and things like that. And the tank weight, I mean, as I lay out in the book, a lot of the modern tanks, so the K2 from Korea, Leopard 2, and even the Merkava 4 from Israel, all basically have the same engine and all basically have the same gun. So the crane you need to pull the pack to do an engine change is the same crane, even despite the fact that those tanks vary massively in weight. From about 55 tons up to about 77 tons. So my point is it's not the actual mass of the tank that you really need to worry about, because ground pressure on tanks is really the defining issue. And if you do a deep dive into ground pressures, you find that ground pressures are not significantly different. Ground pressures become significantly different once you drop below about 37 tons. So once you just get down to about the 28, 36 ton mark, then ground pressure weights become a significant factor. But more importantly, the engine weight comes to about half, and the fuel consumption drops massively, and therefore you get a virtuous spiral associated with the weight that has to do with bridging, that has to do with recovery vehicles, that has to do with a whole range of things, logistics, holding spares, how many packs you can put, how many engines, because not everybody speaks Armored Core, how many engines and transmissions combined can you put on an EPLS rack, and things like that all become real points of debate and real points of insight.
I wonder, on the subject of cost, I liked your comparison between the CV90 and the Leopard, I think it was, MTBH and MTBL. And I wonder if any analysis goes into what our reserves are going to fight in, because we're going down the path of a small amount of Challenger 3s, and that goes back, I think, to the Hamish Mundell's article about the first battle bias. It won't take long for your regular army to have exhausted the Rolls-Royce type tanks, and we should be thinking about what the second, third, fourth echelon people are going to use. And I'd love to see something like ATDU, Armoured Trials and Development Unit, have a troop of the lighter version that you've alluded to just see what the art of the possible is, because I think it's crazy that we would cut off our nose to spite our face by going down the Swiss watch tank route and not thinking about what our reserves will use.
Yeah, I mean, the point I should make very, very clear that I did not write this book to fix the British Army. So nothing in this book is about fixing the British Army. It's collective insights that Western armies should look at, and I define that as basically armies that have democratic governments in charge of them. If you have to have a definition of Western, but that doesn't necessarily all hold true. The point really is, you're absolutely right. If you have a small gold-plated collection of armour in any army and you lose that, it will be very, very difficult to replace. If you go out in the market today and try and buy CV90 120 or, well, I mean, let's take CV90 120. They might not have a space on their production line for 18 months. At the minimum, there might not be one for 3 years, even if you go to Poland, if you go to South Korea, they might not have a space on their production line. They might offer to build a production line for you, but you're not going to get a tank off that production line inside a year, and a lot can happen in a year if you haven't got tanks or you don't know how to fight without them. So, yes, there is, I mean, without being relentlessly pessimistic about it, whatever it is you have to perform the tank function, and I'm being deliberately open-ended on that, whatever vehicle you have to perform the tank function, then you have got to have a reasonable number of them, and you've also got to have a reasonable number held in reserve, because you will lose them.
So your doctrine chapter comes up with some interesting concepts. And the one I really did like, I latched onto, was that your fires network is your command network.
Aha.
Now, that's my experience from the BOR days. When I was a brand new soldier, I was lobbed onto the Commander Royal Artillery's net in the regimental command post, and the entire battle was played out on there. So there were battle group and brigade nets, but it was the fires net that really ran the show. Are you of the opinion that you fire to manoeuvre or you manoeuvre to fire?
Oh, I've got to be honest. I think that's a false debate. I don't think it matters. The point I was really trying to make was that if you go out and look for targets, and this is a very broad description, but if you go out to look for targets and you find them, and you have a good enough awareness to strike those targets in the right sequence. So in other words, you don't expend hugely expensive munitions killing bridging kit in a engineer park 500 kilometers away, and that you actually go after the enemy divisional command post, which is 30 kilometers away, providing you have a good enough targeting doctrine, then as you start engaging targets, you maneuver based on those engagements, as in the opportunities that creates or the amount of peril that puts you in because you've discovered that in your effort to locate the enemy, you've discovered the enemy and he's moving towards you from an unexpected direction. So it's really about the commander having a good enough ISARR picture, which is intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance for anybody who's new to this, and not an ISARR picture that is trying to deluge him with information on which to base decisions. So it's about making everything simpler, quicker, finding a target, engaging it, understanding what that target was, why it was there in time and space, and then, if you need to, manoeuvring against it or exploiting the opportunity that destroying that target gave you. And it's very easy to describe the Fires Command network as a distinct thing, but a lot of it is going to be driven by the precise context you put it into and the sort of force density that you find the enemy in. I think the days of the Russians attacking in hordes of company columns going back 200 kilometers, I think those days are pretty much done, and that you're going to be looking at a battlefield which contains far more elusive and low exposure targets. So the level of judgment exercised by commanders is probably going to have to be tested to find who can do it and who can't. And that might not be a culturally popular choice for some armies to make, because, you might have to tell the chosen child that, whilst he's very, very good at everything, he really hasn't got the level of fingertip awareness, that this game might not be for him. But I don't see another way to do it, given, the challenges we not only have historically faced, but we will almost certainly continue to face in the future.
The future is still going to contain infantry, though. I think we can all agree with that. But the infantryman has evolved considerably. You talk a lot in the book about the infantry being a sensor, not just a bayonet. What's the human advantage that technology still can't replicate on the battlefield?
Well, I mean, considering this podcast is run by a former member of 473, it is the human, factor, which is absolutely irreplaceable in war, and no amount of unattended ground sensors will get you what humans get you. Having said that, that is becoming an increasingly difficult argument to make, bearing in mind what unattended ground sensors can actually get you these days. But no, I mean, infantry is the ultimate precision weapon. Infantry you can put anywhere on the battlefield. You can put it inside a room with innocent civilians, unarmed men, and it will still be able to make the right decision. And I'm not just saying this as a former infantryman. Infantry suffer the highest casualties. It's the least glamorous job in terms of what doesn't get conflated with sort of special forces groupieism. But dismounted close combat is not something anyone should seek to do in their right mind, in my view. And quite frankly, I consider the acme of dismounted close combat, walking onto a smoking cratered position, which the Royal Artillery has made a moonscape out of. However, I think the modern enemy is very aware of that. The modern enemy will disperse to the degree where it becomes increasingly costly and difficult to create moonscapes, which you can walk onto. But the infantryman, because he can go anywhere on the battlefield and because he is low signature, we should probably start paying as much attention to his communications and sensors as we do to his weapons. And I mean, in the book, I deliberately kind of glossed over the whole weapons debate, because otherwise you were going to get into people saying, oh, give me back my SLR and, you know, the SA-80, there's something wrong with it. And I didn't really want to get into that because having carried both, I didn't really have a strong opinion on either. But yeah, good chunky weapons that knock people down are always going to be popular, but that's not really the level of debate we should be getting into and, you know, trying to equip every section commander with a 5-watt digital IP-based radio and giving him a sensor that can generate a Cat 1 grid. And a Category 1 grid, for your listeners, is, I think, a 6 metre by 6 metre grid in time and space. But that's the sort of stuff gunners need and close air support needs to start putting, firepower on target. If everybody accepts that the infantry are evolving, we should be evolving the infantry more into a sensor rather than just somebody designed to, stab somebody in the face with a bayonet. Fun though that may be.
Just a quick one before you go on, Neil. When I were a lad, Wilf, reducing the sensor to shooter length was like the holy grail. And now you've got targeting software like Palantir, which has been used extensively lately. And it's taken the human decision making out of that. And there's a lot of discussion about the morality behind this, which our potential adversaries do not have to take into account. What's your feeling on AI and targeting and the way we'll be heading with that, bearing in mind the moral quandary that Western democracies will have about using it?
I think I'd be very careful of using the term AI, because I think AI has become somewhat of a bumper sticker. A lot of what people have described to me as AI, and this includes people working in the military AI field, is to me really machine automation. I mean, number plate recognition has been around for 30 years. It's shape recognition. It's not AI. So when it comes down to targeting, I think that you really have to treat it on a case-by-case basis. So a missile that has a seeker head on it, that if you launch it into a 500 meter to 500 meter box and it can autonomously detect an AFV shaped target and attack it, I don't really have a problem with that. It's a TRL-9. It's a deployable technology that already exists. Likewise, I don't have a problem with a loitering munition that hangs around at 18,000 feet waiting for someone to switch on a radar. And if someone does switch on a radar or a radio that has a particular transmission characteristic, it dives down and hits them with a 18 kilogram warhead. I don't have a problem with that. Those are desirable weapons characteristics for particular problems. I think where you do have a problem is where people are just prepared to hand over the plan to some AI planning software or hand over the fire planning to some AI planning or some machine automated software, because tiny little errors can generate some fairly significant errors later down the line. And I mean, I can speak to that personally because I built considerable quantities of Excel spreadsheets to check the logistics of my divisional structure, which I discuss in the book. And it was only one day that I sat and said, hang on a second, can I really justify where that figure came from? And did a trace back through all the logics and the formulas I'd put in the spreadsheet and found out that something was not just 50, but 200% off. Now, it doesn't really matter what that is, but if that error existed in core level or a divisional level planning software, it would have resulted in someone asking for 180 more 10,000 litre tankers than they actually needed. So when people start talking about computer says no, that's really the danger area, is when you can't explain the causal link of events that AI might take you towards. And sooner or later, if it comes down to the court of inquiry, you can't just say, well, that's the number the computer spat out, because the reason you spend whatever it is, 37 weeks at Sandhurst, and the reason you do all your training and everything is so as you actually know that stuff and that you're not relying on the computer to do it for you, other than those things that we accept that computers do reasonably well.
The infantry guy still around then for a while, and they are a sensor, and you describe them as a precision weapon. But how do you square the circle of investing in training time to ensure that the infantry is ready for war, can stick bayonets in faces, versus evolving them as a recce strike element to try and ensure the contact battle is as painless as possible? How do we evolve the infantry to become all things to all men, stick a bayonet in, and precisely target something?
I think it starts with culture. And I mean, that's one area in the book I didn't really go into because it is a rabbit hole. So let's go down that rabbit hole now. Armies aren't based on evidence. Armies are based on shared beliefs and ideas. That there is no explicable reason why armies do a lot of the things they do. I mean, why do armies believe that drill is the core of their discipline system? I believe drill can be done just as well by American cheerleaders, could probably do as good a drill as the Guards, and that's going to definitely get me some hate. But they understand timing, and they do drill that's a lot more complicated than Guardsmen. I mean, it's a physical skill. You can teach anyone to do it. Why we believe that's the core of discipline, I don't know. So I'd start with culture, and that culture would be when you induct infantrymen into their basic training, you're very, very literal with them about their job is to go out and find the enemy so that other people can kill that enemy. And only in extremis will they have to engage the enemy themselves. And they should be prepared for extremis because they understand the reasons why fire support might not be available, because they understand the fragility of comms. They understand that sensors can be fooled. So it's an education game, and education doesn't have to mean the classroom. Education can mean the training area, constant repetition, and looking for those soldiers who do get it. So you elevate them to be junior NCOs. And the guys that are going to do 3 years and then go and work in a garage somewhere or become postmen, they go and do that. And the kids that really have a knack for it and can help train other people climb up the slippery slope till they become RSM. And when they become RSM, they inculcate the rest of the battalion with that value, with that idea that this is what you do and this is how we do it. When I joined the infantry, there was a fairly brutal outlook on life, which was based around a lot of values that I think that society today would have a few issues with, to put it mildly. And speaking to two gunners of roughly my age, I think we all know what we're talking about. Alcohol is not the answer to everything. And the Army's made great strides in that respect. That's good. Some good things have probably been lost along the way. But again, that is down to culture. Once you get the culture right, I think that the training is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think you'd have to have a 3-week-long conference to work out how you turn an 18-year-old into a good target finder, and how you teach him to shoot, conduct, maneuver, do battlefield medical techniques and all of that within a 24-week training period. I think that's fairly well understood. But you've just got to create the culture in which the people training him want to do it and believe that it's the right thing to do.
One of your chapters is about the cavalry. Cavalry charged the Russian guns, mow down the Saxons at Hastings. It's an old word and you've kept it alive. But what does it mean in modern warfare? Is it a mindset or is it a role?
It's a bit of both. So I did one. I used it to wind up some readers because I'm a reasonably flippant, spiky guy, and I love doing that. And two is, to me, I didn't want to say infantry and armour, which is why I was quite careful about the terms of saying infantry, cavalry and fires. Now, that might seem somewhat pedantic, but in fact, what I was trying to create is a division between the cavalry who fight mounted and train and optimize themselves to fight mounted, and the infantry who train and optimize themselves to fight dismounted. Now, if everybody's riding around in armored fighting vehicles that, don't necessarily make the delineation between the two obvious, then that discussion becomes far more complicated than it needs to be. So I really wanted to make the point that there's going to be some troops who optimize to fight mounted, whether that's in light vehicles with heavy weapons on or whether that's in main battle tanks. And then there's going to be infantry who can move around the battlefield in light vehicles, trucks, or heavy armoured personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles. At the point of application, the infantry is getting out of the vehicle and fighting, and the cavalry is staying on the vehicle and fighting, except in extremis. And one of the things, we need to realise historically is that British cavalry, certainly in the early 20th century, was just as proficient as the infantry at fighting dismounted if they needed to, and they had the same weapon. Now, that's a characteristic of modern warfare that we've lost, unless you take it that the modern IFV mounted infantryman is much the same creature. But again, in terms of wanting to optimize him as a dismounted sensor, there might be better ways to do that, and there might be more cost-effective ways of do that. And also just making, the training approach massively simpler.
Interesting. You've also got I think in your Monash infantry company, you describe the forward observer as being an organic part of the subunit headquarters. So a bit of a change in emphasis from the traditional way that we see an FST or a FU being attached from the gunners. You sort of allude to a better use of a forward observer being organic to the infantry company. I think there are benefits and there are also risks to that. But what's your gut feeling? Is the forward observer organic to the infantry, or is he attached?
I don't think it makes a lot of difference. I deliberately put it in the book as something to get people to send me hate mail, stand up in Parliament and ask questions. I have no interest in talking with people who agree with me. I'm far more interested in talking to people who don't agree with me. I find there's real value in that. But the question really is, does the forward observer have to be a gunner? And what does it mean to be a gunner? I mean, not just in the British Army, but in any army anywhere in the world. Does it mean that you wear a special type of uniform? Does it mean you were trained in a particular way? Does it mean you wear a hat with a red band or a purple band around it? I mean, it doesn't really matter. My point is, being a forward observer is a skill set and a body of knowledge. You have to be able to do the job. Whether you can do the job or not is testable and measurable. You can either do it or you can't. That even goes back to Invatron simulators in my day, where I have to say I had a sneaking suspicion that I was just as good as the gunners who were sitting on the bench next to me in terms of getting the right grid reference and getting the rounds onto it. I don't think it really matters. My point is that that's the example I'm giving. If you're going to argue against that he has to be a gunner, then you're going to have to produce a very good body of evidence to prove to me that, he can't possibly be an infantryman, and that he does have to belong to the Royal Regiment or similar in whatever army it is. Who makes that rule? If they make that rule, then there's got to have a good reason for making it.
Where do you stand in that hoary old chestnut, the regimental system, Wilf?
I believe the regimental system is, it's a former Royal Green Jacket. I believe the regimental system is absolutely essential, and it's the core of the British Army. No, because, we're now the Rifles, so... Again, I don't think it's very important in terms of force structures and how you seek to fight. I mean, the primary benefit of the regimental system is morale. It's that shared understanding. It's that being together as a group, a shared experience. And it's especially important in the infantry and armour. I mean, engineers are extremely odd people in that, a friend of mine said, if you command engineers, then in his day, you could be commanding anybody from a diver to a postman, both with the same cap badge. You knew one was a diver because he never stopped telling you he was a diver. But I mean, that's whereas the postman, I think, tended to keep quiet about it. I think the regimental system is a very essential thing for the British Army. It's remarkably less important in other organisations. In the British Army, it's the regiment. It's more correctly regimental systems. It's not a system, because, I mean, the Gunners is a regiment, isn't it? I mean, there are batteries within but commando gunners all like to think they have a particular ethos. Air defence, I'm assuming they think they have some sort of, collective ethos. I don't know. There is this sense of shared ideas and shared values, which the regimental system holds together. To be absolutely honest with you, I mean, to answer your question as brutally as I can, is it's very important. I think it's a distraction from more important questions when it comes down to equipping, training and organising a future armed force.
Okay, we'll get on to the proper army now. Fires and the artillery.
I think you're about to be shot down, mate.
I'm not going to bang on about it, actually. I know that you said this wasn't about fixing the British Army, but I think when you look at what we historically used to be able to bring to bear, you give a really good example of what's required to attack a 400-metre frontage of a BMP platoon. We don't have the amount of guns that you're using in your example. You talk about 18 guns, and we're looking at establishments of 12 guns. The generation of extra batteries won't be rapid. So if you've got less guns, you can't attack as much or as fast or in the same rate of fire. And this is only about targeting a BMP platoon. And I contend that we don't have the firepower to support the close battle anymore in the British Army. And I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on how we might get out of this mess. But to start with, I think the artillery has become a precision system. And I think that our precision obsession is making our logistics unfit for purpose. And therefore, if we wanted to ramp back up to doing suppression and area effect on a large scale, we won't then have the lift. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on how we might square this circle of supporting the close battle, lifting our ammunition, and also being able to do precision attack onto point targets that might end up with their destruction.
Right. So, I mean, I think the first question is, artillery, as I explain, is purely useful in terms of what it does to physical structures and then, more importantly, the human mind. So destruction, suppression are all these measures against specific target sets based on specific weights of fire. Now, is the enemy, is a future enemy or even a current enemy going to array himself in a way that allows you to do that to him? The BMP platoon model I picked was out of the I forgot what it was. I think it was the 1978 edition of the ISB, which is a book anyone who's anybody who's ever had anything to do with Soviet studies will have on their bookshelf. In fact, I've got 2 copies. I'm that sad. But I literally went, dug out my old Soviet studies stuff and said, how does the BMP platoon lay itself out? Talked to some very knowledgeable retired and serving senior gunners and junior gunners and said, what do you think? Everybody came back with roughly the same answer. So that's the answer that's in the book. How you make better use of those guns in terms of rate of fire, how long you want to expose them for, what risk you want to put them at just to perform a close support mission are all questions that need asking. I think the use of precision has the ability to produce a better laydown of close support rather than reducing mass. So in other words, using the same mass more efficiently to cover a bigger or smaller area. So it really comes down to the amount of shells you dump into a hectare or a 50 metre by 50 metre grid. So if you say all I need to suppress that position is I need to put 2 rounds, air bursting rounds, high fragmentation, I need to put 2 of those into every 50 metre square, then you're going to be relatively efficient at suppressing or destroying that enemy position. I think it's unlikely that the enemy's ever going to array itself in those sort of ways again. And if they do, then that's great, because I think it's something that modern fires can handle relatively easily, especially as people are showing more and more interest now in 120mm mortars, which means that the unit level will be able to handle a lot of things that otherwise they used to have to offload to a close support fire mission. And the other aspect is that if you have infantry who are finders and can generate Cat 1 and Cat 2 grids, then delivering a warhead into that 6 metre by 6 metre or whatever it is metre box becomes substantially less complicated than it used to be, and it can be done with a greater level of assurance. So I think that the real answer is there needs to be a complete rethink of what the close support mission really means. And that needs to be evidence-based, and you need to start with the target set. I used the BMP platoon because it was definable. It's something I feel a lot of readers, certainly of my age, would understand. Everybody knows what a BMP is. They can Google BMP platoon layout on the internet. It's something that's apparent and very easy to get your head round, and it's a building block after that. But it shouldn't be the standard target which we train against. We need to have a complete rethink about what it is we're looking at close support fires to do and why we're asking them to do it, because that is the enabler to absolutely everything else. I mean, everyone gets very excited about deep fires. Destroying an enemy command post 30 kilometers behind the lines might have a catastrophic effect, but that catastrophic effect might not be apparent for hours, whereas the ATGM screen, which is, firing AT-14s into your flank, probably needs taking out in fairly short order. And that's going to need to, you're going to need to place HE on those guys in less than a minute. And that's all possible these days. I mean, the technology to enable rapid and responsive fires is extremely mature, as in it is technically possible for an observer to fire the gun that is in support of, or at least cue the gun that is in direct support of his call sign. Whether you want to do that or whether the gunner organisation would allow a Lance Corporal to do that is another thing entirely. But the whole debate about close support and the division of labour between close support and deep fires needs a thorough dusting off, and I hope that's what the book is pointing people towards.
Didn't we have a conversation, Neil, where you advocated giving close support to the infantry, I think in the form of 120 mortars?
Yeah, I think I've personally long thought that this is an overdue move, and I think that there are... I'm not saying I'm responsible for it, because it's obviously been something that's been in train for quite a while, but I think there are moves now to get 120s into the battle groups, and I think that'll be an interesting development, but it should be a good development given that the AFVs that they ride in and the sensors that the dismounts carry now, we've just talked about them being a sensor, you can target things well within your company area, and now you should be able to wallop them with 120s. I think it's a long overdue change.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly technically possible. If you look at the old bunker busting drill from Brecon, where, you got suppressed by one bunker and you then manoeuvred towards it over 20 minutes and you ended up posting a grenade through the firing aperture. I mean, it is perfectly possible to stand 300 metres or even 150 metres away from that bunker, laze the grid off it and hit that bunker with an individual artillery or mortar round. More likely to be a mortar round because you can do laser-guided mortar rounds or a rocket. And there's no difference between doing that or hitting it with any form of shoulder launch projectile. My gut feeling is that should now become the norm. Everybody can say, well, comms break down. Well, comms were going to break down using Klansman back to an 81mm mortar base plate versus using a 21st century radio back to 120mm mortar base plate. I mean, that's just war. Things go wrong, but you stand a better chance of a positive outcome if you can employ 120. 120 is not mobile to that extent. So, I mean, again, infantry culture is going to play a role in that, because sooner or later people in the parachute regiment are going to say, well, I can't carry a 120mm mortar on my back. No, you can't, mate. So you've got to skin that cat in a different way. Having said that, I've always thought, my personal experience of man-packing 81mm mortars was it was never really an act of war. People did it. So if you do it, something's got to be trained.
Three-power mortars are pretty much open to anything anyway, Wilf.
Yeah,
and that's for another podcast.
Better you said that than me. Yeah.
Okay, so that's proper artillery covered. Let's move on to one of the ginger step kits, air defence. The sky is more crowded than ever, be that drones, missiles, EW. If you were going to start air defence doctrine from scratch, what's rule number one? What's the thing you've got to counter first of all, above all else?
The thing I'm most scared of is a fast jet carrying 8 tons of ordnance. That's the thing that's going to kill me in large numbers. I'm not really worried about a drone. A drone might kill 1 or 2 people. It might damage a vehicle. It might destroy a vehicle. It's the Sukhoy pick your number thing rolling in on you that you probably can't see or hear, because the ordnance he's releasing many kilometers away, be that glide bombs or guided weapons. That's the thing that's going to ruin your day. Likewise, attack helicopters. The missile launched off an attack helicopter averagely hits with 77 times the kinetic energy that most loitering munitions hit with. So again, I'm really worried about attack helicopters. And then sooner or later, you do come down to the fact that you don't want to be detected by drones, or UAS. I'm not really worried about quadcopters that stay up for 30 minutes and have a low-resolution commercial camera. I'm far more worried about the thing that's sitting at 12,000 feet, that's got a high-resolution thermal imaging sensor and is actually looking at the exhaust off my Land Rover as I'm running the engine, because I don't want the BV to drain the battery. In the days where we might get BVs in soft-skin vehicles, but I don't see that happening any time too often. But that's it. You might be running the engine to keep the radios going. It's the thing that can see your exhaust at 5 kilometers. That's the thing that's going to kill you. Quadcopters is a small arms bead curtain kind of problem. If air defence isn't paying attention to the capacity to knock down incoming precision munitions, fast jets and attack helicopters, then it's failing. Detecting something like a quadcopter can be done with handheld devices, backpack-worn kind of devices, things like that. If you want to detect a fast jet 30 kilometres away, you need quite a big, chunky radar. The threats I'm worried about are the things that can deliver, 100-kilogram warheads. I'm not really worried about something that's dropping grenades. Distressing and difficult though that might be to cope with, but hopefully the other aspects of all of this is that air defence in the round isn't just about shooting down aeroplanes. It's about detecting them and also having the electronic warfare resources to disrupt and make it very hard for people to use their drones whilst enabling you to use your drones.
Do you think the lack of an air war in Ukraine, and by that I mean, fast jets, etc., is distorting what we're taking from the ground war in some respects?
Absolutely. 100%. If one side had air superiority, you would never have seen drones. If one side had competent air superiority, you would never have seen drones that manifest themselves in the level of discussion which they have. The Israeli operation against Iran showed that it's perfectly possible to degrade a modern air defense network, including, some of the latest Russian equipment, very quickly and very effectively, and then you can roam free over enemy territory. So if you're looking at, something like a Hermes 900 drone, which can carry a sensor that can identify armored vehicles at 70 kilometers, there's open source material on that, which is, in fact, I reference it in the book. You can spot a tank at 70 kilometers and you can kill that tank at 70 kilometers. If you have air superiority, and the overwhelming lesson from history, every successful combined arms army that's ever triumphed over anybody has had air superiority. That is or at least, a level of air parity that has enabled them to protect their ground assets. Any time you have a combined arms army that loses air superiority, they lose, and they lose very badly. Everybody from the Afrika Korps to panzer divisions in Normandy to even the Japanese in the Manchuria campaign in 1945.
Of course, the Israelis referenced that attack about Iran. A lot of the aircraft they used there were not brand spanking new generation aircraft. A lot of them were quite old, but with decent upgrades. So again, there's another lesson there, I think, isn't there?
The thing that's certainly apparent to me as an observer of that campaign is the F-35, which everyone goes on about, was primarily a reconnaissance platform. It was primarily used to get deep into the enemy integrated air defense system and locate targets for aircraft with standoff weapons to then strike from considerably further away. They didn't have to get inside the air defense bubble because they were losing air-launched ballistic missiles and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think the whole conversation about drones, if you're being really honest about it, can't be had in an honest fashion without saying the reason that what you're seeing in Ukraine is the way it is because neither side hasn't made particularly good use of the air environment or feels it is unable to do so.
Let's lower the tone a little bit and talk about engineering. There's one really interesting thread in one of your chapters that I found fascinating and wondered why we don't have this kind of capability in numbers in the British Army, and that's the D9 dozer. And of course, I've seen this thing on news reports with the Israelis.
Is that massive size of a house thing?
Yeah.
Bulldozer.
Yeah. I mean, why have we not got such a vehicle throughout the Western armies? Why is it something that only Israel seems to do?
Well, I think one is definitely in terms of Israel, it does have a bit of an image problem because of some of the things that the bulldozer has been used for. But I've seen these things work very close to, and they're nothing but impressive in terms of what they can do. So most Israeli tank companies have at least 2 D9s attached to them. And any time that company comes to a stop, they have tank companies, not tank squadrons. Don't worry about it. They're just different. Anytime that company comes to a stop, the 2 D9s get offloaded, or they're not fast. So, you have to think about moving them from A to B. And they just start pushing up walls of dirt, several meters high, and the tanks pull in behind those. So that's good. That's your protection certainly from direct fire, if not indirect fire systems. As I show in the book, they're capable of doing some things verging on the unnatural. I mean, one of the really impressive things they can do is if you come across a 3 meter by 3 meter anti-tank ditch, they can just push dirt into it. You don't have to deploy a bridge. You don't have to come up with clever methods. You just push dirt into it until that hole is full. They can push their way through minefields. Sooner or later, you will lose the blade. But if you haven't struck too many mines on the way through, they can demolish a motorway. It wasn't something I had naturally thought of, but I was talking to a friend of mine about a particular military problem, about denying a bridge. And he said, well, you don't have to deny the bridge. You can just deny the approaches. And I said, so what are you looking at? And he said, well, being a Royal Engineer officer, he immediately started rambling on about crabs and things like that. And I had no idea. And I said, well, if I had a D9 bulldozer, would that? And he said, absolutely. And so I then went and consulted with some friends of mine who've used D9s for real. And they said, yep, absolutely. That is duck soup for us. That's nothing we wouldn't find too problematic. So, yeah, and particularly in the urban environment, providing you're not faced with multi-story buildings. I mean, if you're faced with the sort of buildings you find in the average European large town or village, they can be used offensively or defensively in ways which I would imagine would be immediately apparent to any experienced army officer or, anybody with any good knowledge of land warfare, either in creating manoeuvre or denying manoeuvre. They're a very useful bit of kit. However, they do have an image problem, and they do need quite a lot of support. So they're very, very physically slow. So you need to put them on low loaders, and you need to think about where you're going to park them and where you're going to keep them and how you're going to conceal them and when and where to use them. Because certainly in the Lebanon in 2006, they were heavily employed, and Hezbollah expended a lot of anti-tank missiles trying to disable them. For whatever reason, during that particular phase of the war, they had run out of their particularly skilled operators. They're a key piece of machinery, literally worth their weight in gold, in my opinion. If someone can find a cheaper, better way to do that with a lighter vehicle, then I don't have shares in Caterpillar. I probably should, but if someone can find a cheaper, better way to do it, I mean, I'm sure some Japanese company makes an equally good bulldozer. But yeah, heavy bulldozers with that sort of capability are definitely something to keep an eye on.
Another point I picked up in that chapter was about our move away from pioneers. I don't see how we can rapidly or extensively put our force, maybe even more importantly, the command and control headquarters, below ground. Why do you think we've moved away from pioneering?
I think it's because it's something that recent operational experience hasn't called for. Anything that wasn't an Afghanistanism or an Iraqism, including fires, has suffered in that respect. Now, strangely enough, even long before I started listening to this podcast, I was a fan of the Mexi shelter, having been in one as a junior soldier. Since looking back on it as being probably not great judgment in terms of, how the thing was put together and its level of safe in terms of a safety case. But yes, the ability to get underground and remain concealed, anyone with 473 or similar specialist OP experience understands. It's not war winning, but it's certainly a very, very valuable capability and will always be so when correctly applied. But the reason we went away from being able to put people underground was because it wasn't something that was demanded. And the other point is I'm old enough to remember when the 4-man trench came in, because when I went through basic training, there wasn't the 4-man trench. There was the 2-man trench with the kip sheet, which was another health and safety nightmare. The idea that you were going to secure 2 tons of soil on paracord and a piece of plastic. So the problem with the 4-man trench was that it was never trained enough with. So every time you actually had to dig in, with the Wrigley tin and the stakes and the 100 gauge wire and the 6-inch pickets and all the rest of it, it was never a very particularly slick operation. It was never accomplished in time because no infantry battalion was really going to give the time over to becoming slick and adapt with it. And also it was too fiddly and too precise, in my view, to be of use. And I don't think it was actually a very good design. I mean, I've seen recently on YouTube film of some of the testing, and why that was ever deemed fit for purpose, I don't know. I think if you look at what some Scandinavian armies managed to do with wood is far more effective. The Germans have got a system that uses plastic. There's some really good systems out there. And in fact, I mean, I'm going to give a shout out. There's an excellent website called Think Defence.
It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's run by an ex-Royal Engineer, Lance Jack. He really goes into the weeds on a lot of this stuff, and it's a really, really good resource. I could bore for Britain on trench design, if somebody wanted me to, and why we haven't re-engaged with the problem. Having said that, the whole idea of fighting from trenches in itself, I think, needs to be revisited. I think the idea of putting 4 men in a trench and expecting them to hold ground is antiquated and past its sell-by date, and you've got to think of better ways of why you're doing this and how you're doing it. And if I was to think about how to dig in an infantry battalion, I would be looking at more in a sort of underground shelter OP kind of configuration, as in you're digging in sensors rather than people who are going to die in their trench blazing away with automatic fire, because I don't necessarily see that as being something a modern audience would necessarily want to engage with. In Germany, I think we were, because, we were all aware we were going to be fighting a nuclear war, so I don't think we questioned it too much. I think a modern army would quite rightly be slightly sceptical of that approach.
And if you looked,
they'd probably recognise the kip sheet as a placebo as well.
And if you look to Ukraine, that's what you're seeing out there, essentially. They don't have those trench positions like we used to have in the Cold War.
Yeah, no. I mean, they're digging ribbon trenches, which tells me it's more of a human instinct than anything else. And the attendant casualty levels, I think, speak to that. There's probably better ways to do it, but the better ways require in-depth training, better ideas, and training approach that allows for that to happen.
Wasn't one of the reasons that you stuck 3 or 4 people in a trench was sort of the moral support that they give each other? Because I'm reading some stuff now what's happening in Ukraine, and they're talking about 3 or 4 people holding a kilometre and sometimes being on their own. And I just think that moral fortitude required to do that is off the scale.
The 2-man trench, the great weakness of the 2-man trench concept was if one of you was wounded, the other one was probably not very keen on continuing or was probably trying to treat the wounded person. So the 4-man trench, or maybe even the 5, or maybe the continuous ribbon trench, does have some utility. It's where you site it and how you use it. Trying to replicate the same Cold War idea with a Wrigley tin trench with shelter bays, you were never going to stand in the rain with that for 2 weeks with the thing filling up around your knees. I think that's one of the other things the modern experience of soldiering hasn't missed. These guys in the Ukraine are sometimes in their trenches for 30 days at a time, and I think whatever approach to field engineering, field fortifications we take in the future, we've got to encompass the idea that you might be static in that position for an entire tour, very probably. And how you rotate and regenerate people out in defensive positions, again, is something that we haven't paid enough attention to. If you've had a company dug in for a week, do you want to take them out and replace them with another company whilst they go away get some hot food, showers, sort themselves out, and then climb back into their holes. Of course, certainly that was the experience of both the Second and the First World War, was that companies degraded fairly quickly if you left them out in the weather in a hole in the ground for an extended period of time.
On the combat service support front, I think we all know that logistics isn't glamorous. I think everybody understands that you need supplies to keep yourself going. There was an interesting area that you honed in on was about field hospitals. And I hadn't really considered the field hospital as such an important aspect for where you deploy a division, how you need to train it and recover it, especially with ours belonging to the reserves. Do you think people have thought that about things like this in any great detail since the Cold War sort of ended? Specifically things like you place your hospital there and your division is fixed. Are these things thought of? Are they discussed? Are they war-gamed?
They're certainly, I can say from personal experience, they're certainly war games, because I've been involved. I was involved some years ago with looking at that exact problem. I'm almost making this figure up, but I seem to remember that the average the British Army field hospital exists in something like 40 20-foot containers, or something like that. There's some fairly scary figures. The wife of a friend of mine has commanded a reserve field hospital, and the level of not just clinical expertise, but the level of engineering expertise and everything, including finding enough flat open ground, informing people of where the hospital is. And I mean, it's a dark art. Designing the equipment for field hospital is an industry in and of itself. I think the problem is that people haven't really... The received wisdom of field hospitals is now based around two sets of experience. One is BAOR, where, yes, there was a casualty handling plan and they had thought it through and they had charts to say, what was and wasn't possible. But at the end of the day, you were fighting an existential nuclear war. So nobody, wanted to burrow into that too deeply. The other experience is expeditionary warfare operating from fixed bases, where you can afford to have a very high level of surgical field care at a fixed site. And you probably have the air situation where you can definitely lift people from the point of wounding to, and have them on a table in less than an hour. So you then get into the whole golden hour issue, for which there is no medical evidence, by the way. I've never been able to find the medical evidence is that it is better to get them into surgery quicker than it is to delay that process. And if you say it's an hour, that's going to be better than saying it's 2 hours. But in terms of commanders' risk and all this sort of stuff that gets discussed in command post exercises, having mobile medical facilities is certainly one way to start addressing that problem. And the other way to start addressing that problem is to be able to evacuate people out of theatre as quickly as possible. So if you look at how the medical system's set up in terms of the casualty then going to intensive care and cutting down the time that he's in intensive care to where he's safe to be moved, he or she, obviously, and how you're going to move them from an airhead or a sea base or a railhead, all feeds into that argument. But no, it's definitely how to design a field hospital for modern corps, theatre or divisional or even brigade operations is something that does need to be looked at. However, it's an incredibly complicated question. I mean, as someone like me is not going to be able to skin that cat in the number of pages I had to write that book. I hope what that chapter has done is shine a light on some of the important questions you need to ask. The quite brutal point I would make is only the dead speak to policy. No British government is going to rise or fall on the amount of seriously wounded. It is going to rise and fall on the amount of dead. So it doesn't matter how many, quadruple amputees you've got coming back, brutal though it may say. If you've saved them, and they're not dead, and their name isn't on a memorial anywhere. Whereas the dead, will somehow drive policy. So I think there's a bit of cold-blooded pragmatism which has to be fed into that, where you need to start talking to doctors and switching off the emotional responses. The other thing about field hospitals, which I don't think people get, is they have massive political utility in terms of deploying them to disaster sites and humanitarian cases and things like that. But to me, that would speak to you want to have a specialist medical unit that deals with civil disasters. In other words, it's part of the UK flying the flag abroad, or whichever company. I mean, the Israelis have a specialist earthquake unit that deploys all over the world. And it even goes to countries that don't quite really like Israel. But the Israelis have become specialists at digging people out of buildings for, reasons that they seem to excel at. But if the UK wants to have a specialist humanitarian care medical organisation, it should probably be something distinct in terms of military structures, because the sort of medical facilities you need for a mobile modern division probably need to be pretty specialised in terms of how quickly they can move initial operating capability to full operating capability and things like that.
I think there's also some important questions, and I've got no idea if they're being addressed now, but at the point of wounding also, you mentioned that golden hour. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine, there's going to be some young medics making some difficult triage decisions when they can't get any Medivac, Casivac for 24 plus hours. And I was reading an article there recently about how tourniquets are being applied in Ukraine, for example, and a lot of poorly applied tourniquets being applied where they shouldn't, because these Medivacs, Casivacs are taking so long, they're leading to limb loss and a whole host of other problems. Is the army also looking at things like how they're going to deal with people at the point of wounding in a modern battle space?
I read a similar thing a few days ago, and where the Ukrainian experience seems to be the golden 24 hours. They accept that there's no way on earth people are being taken out of some of the spots that they're wounded in within an hour. And so they don't look at it like that, I don't think. You're right about the tourniquet example, but I have no more experience about it than that.
No, I would say that the evidence that I've looked at strongly leans towards what you need to have is very solid medical training across the entire unit. So the idea that you have a specialist medic, part of the job that specialist medic has to be able to do is he has to be able to train more medics. So as there's a proliferation of general medical skills, so as everybody can put on a tourniquet, do it correctly, and that everybody can make those judgments. Because, I mean, the other thing that I think, people don't really understand is that a really good combat medical technician of whatever size or shape. You look at some of the medical training that some people in special forces go through. And in fact, I think, even people went through down at the LERP school at Weingarten. That's not cheap. That's not easy. And you've got to have a person there who's going to be able to pass on that skill set across his unit and not just be the little specialist, break glass in case of war. I see the whole medical thing primarily as a training challenge, and also then having the equipment to train with, and then having the resources available in the unit that when you go to war, there is enough medical kit knocking around. And I think that's probably very beneficial outcome of Iraq and Afghanistan, is that people do now recognise that has a primacy, whereas I think in my day, everyone got thrown a respirator bag packed with first field dressings, and that was supposed to be the medical kit. So those days are hopefully long gone, and people are taking it a bit more seriously.
I did that medics course back in the late 80s, and it shocked me how primitive British first aid was after coming off that course.
You guys used to have some people you'd go into A&E departments, didn't you, in hospitals? Some of these.
They tried that because when they designed the course, Colonel Stone went to Hereford, he went to 2-9, he went, the Airborne Brigade and the Commando Brigade, and they thought they'd do a hospital week. But I think the most illuminating thing the guys saw was some CO's wife having her piles operated on, and they... and they ended up binning it. And the LERP school came along, and that offered a good level of training for what we were doing anyway.
I did like the way, though, that the book looked at casualties as a log problem before CSUPs. I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at logistics in the round. And the hospital thing, obviously, you need to train it. It needs to be ready. You also talk about readiness being the test of any army. And I'm going to quote you here. If any army is not ready to move in 2 days or less, it is a force of doubtful political utility compared to one that can and is ready. So why have we forgotten this lesson across the West? And this isn't just a British problem. I would imagine that Israel is a bit more swept up with readiness, but I'm not sure many countries across Western Europe are.
I've looked at the Israeli issue in considerable detail. Their problem was that when you mobilise basically 300,000 people from a standing start, it doesn't matter how slick your processes are, you physically run out of trucks to pick up the body armour from the stores to deliver it to the mobilisation site, to have the people who can actually hand out the body armour, to do the paperwork, to keep track of who got issued with what weapon when, how many magazines. It's a gargantuan problem. Now, let's dial that back, that you're starting with a standing army, so you have a formed unit in a camp, let's say Tidworth. The first thing that militates against it in the British Army is whole fleet management. Every unit should have all its vehicles ready to go, as we did in Germany. The active edge thing, which we all love, I mean, the thing I used to hate about active edge was cramming your number 2 dress and your bull boots into the bottom of your kit bag, in the idea that there was going to be a victory parade, which I found quite a stretch. So I don't think it has to be active edge levels, but it does have to be the commanding officer gets the phone call from Whitehall, you are to be at the airhead or, the ferry head or wherever railhead in, by this time. And that time period is less than 48 hours away. And given modern mobile phones and absolutely everything else, that should not be a stretch. And given modern logistical and, asset tracking systems, it shouldn't be a stretch to get everybody their ammunition and all the right equipment. And if necessary, all their jabs and dental work and everything else done. I mean, I think the deployment checklist that, have you had a hearing test in the last 35 seconds and all that sort of stuff probably needs a rethink, because, I don't think that's fit for purpose. And why it exists in the way it does is another hard question to be asked about culture, shared ideas and beliefs and health and safety and all that other sort of stuff that gets in the way. But yeah, I mean, it should be completely possible for everybody to get out the gate in 48 hours. And certain units should be able to do it far quicker. And we all know who those are. So I don't think any of this is a stretch. And as I say, I mean, much like I don't think much of what I wrote in the book, I mean, there might be some fairly obvious points of contention where people think I'm raving mad, but the only person that's had a real pop at me so far on the sort of personal basis was someone who said to me, well, you just wrote a book about common sense. And to which I said, yes, that's absolutely correct. I did. And it was said in such a way that I don't think he was even having a pop. I think he was sort of like, he was more saying it out of amazement, which was that, that was the only thing I could do, was write about common sense. And I was like, well, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, yeah, I mean, the readiness is a test of an army is something a lot of people are focused on. And I've kind of find myself asking, well, what other metric would you use? And again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about readiness. If you read the doctrinal definition about readiness, and I can be a bit of a doctrine nerd, readiness is where there is no more training to be done and you have all the resources you need to deploy on operations. So if you're not ready, what does that say about, and ultimately it's a leadership issue. It really is. It's a command and leadership issue.
I like the common sense point because, as I said at the start, I thought Colin wanted me to read the book and argue the toss about things.
No, mate, can I just jump in there? When I started, because I haven't read the full book, but I looked through the chapters and the reviews, and even from the reviews, I knew that you and Wilf would have it just reminded me of what discussion I had with you.
Okay, I can live with that.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because it is just full of common sense, and I'm not trying to blow a trumpet or anything, but some of the things that you're pointing out, as obvious as they seem to me, they have been forgotten in some quarters, and some of this stuff, it's common sense, but it's not been applied. So I've got one sort of last question. The propositions that you outline, that you illustrate, they are generally sound. Are they going to form the skeleton of the Sandhurst or Defence Academy curriculum?
Not a hope, no. I mean, and I think there's quite a good reason, which is, one is you don't want someone like me informing high-level policy. I wrote a book I'm very happy that people read it, as you can read the back cover and see that some fairly sensible grown-ups read the book and broadly agreed with, everything I said, even though I think someone on the back did say it's a challenging read, and he was a gunner. So
not challenging to read.
Yeah, challenging to read. Yeah, it's a challenging read. The purpose of the book is really to get people to ask the hard questions, because there is a slight mood music sometimes in the British Army, which I always used to love. It's not quite, we'll put in a pin in it. I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but it's like, yes, we'll sort of we'll take it outside, and that didn't mean a scrap. It just meant we'll chat about it in the mess. We're not going to solve that problem today. And I was usually the one standing there saying, so when are we going to solve it? But when, it's like, when will this be solved? Because I think it's fairly important. And that's it. So, I mean, as I say, my sole utility isn't my military experience or my writing skill or my, good looks and banter. It's really the freedom of action and the capacity to say, why hasn't this been sorted? If we all agree this is a problem, why hasn't someone done something about it? And I mean, the one example, we haven't touched on it in the discussion, but one of my pet examples is load carrying for the infantry. It's like, you're always overloaded. Why are you always overloaded? This is not a weight problem. It's a leadership and training
problem. A culture problem, I would say, Will.
Exactly. Why are you going into the assault with a jet boil in a pouch on your belt? It's stuff like that I'm only partly joking when I say it makes me quite angry. I actually got banned from Brecon for a period of time as a guest speaker because I had a complete meltdown in front of the audience about why people were going into the assault with jet boils on their belts. And I think, entertaining as it was for the audience, I was really trying to make the point that you need to think very long and hard about what you carry and why you carry it. And everyone goes, yeah, well, that's common sense. We're infantrymen. That's what we do. I remember as a junior soldier, if someone had even come up to me and started questioning why I was carrying it, I would have taken that as the gravest possible insult on my manhood, that I didn't know what to carry and that I didn't know how to carry it. So, it's something that it is all about leadership and culture. We all know that whatever rule you enforce, the second you go out in the square and watch everybody climbing onto the vehicles, everyone's going to be carrying what the hell they want anyway, because no one's going to be told what they need to carry. But again, it's issues like that I feel the book might play a role in highlighting as a discussion. And I do happen to know there is at least one infantry battalion in the British Army who has read the book, and the CO is beginning to have that discussion with his seniors, and it's become quite illuminating. So, progress is being made. I commend
listeners to have a go at the podcast I did with Jimmy Moram, who was our chief instructor back in the day, and he was in 3 Para, and we discussed the Battle of Mount Longdon that he took part in. And that discussion happened about what they were carrying. And Jimmy used to say to us, all you need to carry is ammunition and water, and that is it. And he said, when they attacked Longdon, some of the lads even took the webbing off and just put magazines in their pockets. And I said to him, if you had the choice, would you have carried body armour? And he went, not a chance. He goes, body armour would have slowed us down and prevented movement, and then we had a bit of a discussion about how risk is managed in contemporary military. But absolutely, you look at any World War II photograph of infantry going into the assault, what are they wearing? They've got two ammo pouches and a water bottle. Right. My last question then to Wilf is, can the army recover from its particular low point it's at the minute?
Well, can the British Army? Yes, very easily, but it's nothing to do with the army. So, in my view, and I'm not just saying this because I've worked with them. The current CGS, most of the everybody I've met who's a senior officer in the British Army, is the man of the time. There's the blame does not lie with the current upper echelons of the army. The reason the army is in the state it is because the government has allowed it to get that way. If someone picked up the phone and said to the Chief of the Defence Staff, the army is to be fixed by, this time in 2 years' time, and we're making the funds available to do it, and the civil service has been told to enable it, not stand in the way of it. That's a broad allegation. Yes, it would be fixed. And I don't actually believe money is the issue, because whatever the British government spent on COVID, it could easily spend on defence if it felt the need. All these problems are solvable if you want to. The thing that really infuriates me is again, the mood music, where people go, yes, but we can't do this because of X, Y, Z. Well, that's just, if you need to change the law, then change the law. If people say, oh, you can't do this because of human rights legislation, so opt out of that clause. It's all about political power and political leadership. And, unfortunately, as I also say in the book, is no army can account for the stupidity of the government who's going to put it into a war. That's why, given the money, an army has to have a very serious plan about how to spend it best. And that is where military leadership becomes a key point, is, you have to have a plan when the doors are finally open and the blank check is finally put in front of you, that you know how to spend it and what to spend it on. And that's really, the next exam question. It is solvable, yes.
Well, that's good to finish on an optimistic note. And where can people get a copy of your book? And are you on any social media or that, things like that they can follow you with?
No, I'm not really on social media in any. I mean, I'm not on Instagram or anything like that. Following me on Facebook will lead to nothing but upset for most people who don't share a military sense of humour. Book is available on Amazon and from Howgate Publishing, and Kirsten Howgate does need a shout out as the publisher, who actually said to me, "We hear you have a book. Do you want to publish it with us?" And made that process achievable and doable. And I would say, just for a point, anybody listening to this podcast who thinks they have a military science book in them should definitely get in touch with Howgate Publishing. If you type Euclid's Army into Google, you'll have to try hard not to find the book. And currently, if you can find an unsigned copy, they're probably worth something. So there we go.
Right, that's it then for another episode. Neil, thank you for coming on, mate.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you on. Neil's a bit of a media whore with me, so it's really nice to have a first-timer on.
Oh, it really has been a great pleasure. And, thank you very much indeed.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for that. That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guest for coming on, and to you, the podcast listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. Finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISARR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.